Welcome to Sword of Laban, where we seek greater light and truth and have fun. Now, this video popped up in my YouTube feed the other day, saying that the Empire from the Star Wars movies were the good guys, and the Jedi were the bad guys. Now, the guy takes 30 minutes to go through the movies in great detail and show all the evidence that the Galactic Empire were the good guys. In his own words,
if you look at things with a little less emotion,
don't let your personal feelings get in the way,
a little bit more logic,
come to your senses,
and a tiny spoonful of real-world events,
that's right.
You see it. You see it pretty clearly. You see that the Empire was right.
Now, this is satire. It says so right in the video description. But as I listened, every argument that was made, I just kept hearing these tropes from anti-Mormons or atheists, and how they represent the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I thought it'd be fun to make a video about, so let's watch. I've got my computer right here, so when I look down, I'm going to be watching the video and reacting to this with you real time. So here's the thing. Latter-day Saints and anti-Mormons can get pretty worked up about things, right? Some people are concerned about the eternal welfare of souls, right? Big stuff. It's a big deal. I get it. And atheist anti-Mormons and atheist anti-Christians in general often see it as their mission to rid the world of something that they perceive as harmful, right? So the stakes are high on both sides. So actually, this is a nice analogy because it's nice to take religion out of it for a minute. Let's use the Star Wars movie instead of religion, because nobody's going to get that worked up about Star Wars, right? It's not real life, and it's not real souls, after all. But the interesting thing when you do that is you can see exactly what kinds of tactics are being used. And very important, I'm not actually trying to talk about the Galactic Empire here, right? That's just an analogy. The point of this video is to use this analogy to show how atheists or anti-Mormons can take something as truly good as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and represent it as this awful, horrible thing. How they can take some plain and precious truths and misrepresent them as bad. How they can call evil good and good evil to show that that is possible. And actually, it's very easy to do. Even in the clear-cut case of whether the Jedi were good or not, which should not even be up for debate. And so how much easier is it in the real and the messy world of religion and history, right? Okay, let's dive in. By the way, in my reaction, I'm going to be using the Light and Truth Letter, which is a book that came out last year from a Latter-day Saint man who lost his faith and then regained it. And he regained it after he realized the awful and disingenuous tactics that he'd been fed from anti-Mormons. It's free at lightandtruthletter.com, or it's sold at cost on Amazon. So check it out. But let's dive in. Now, he starts with this disclaimer.
I am not implying that the Empire, Sith, or their associates are perfectly good. And I'm not saying the Jedi, Rebels, or their associates are perfectly evil. But each opposing force sits squarely on a spectrum, with the Empire leaning towards the morally justified side, and the Rebels and Jedi leaning more towards the warmongering, bloodthirsty child molester side.
Okay, so this has actually got a shred of truth. I mean, the fact that there is a spectrum of good and evil, there is good, better, best, there is bad, worse, and worstest. So he's mixing truth with lies to confuse the issue. A half-truth is more destructive than a lie, because a half-truth requires you to untangle the lie from the truth. And I see this all the time in atheist and anti-Mormon arguments. But let's continue. I'm not even done with the intro yet, and so let's let the man speak.
First and foremost, I'm going to start with an obvious point. What makes the Jedi so good? They call themselves the peacekeepers of the galaxy.
We're keepers of the peace.
But they are quite violent.
Okay, so first, he starts to work on your distrust for authority. The idea that any institutional structure with hierarchy is up to no good. You know, that's like saying, oh, if the church donated such and such money to this, it must have been for nefarious reasons. Okay, here the manipulator wins if the target believes that they can no longer trust the church. So let's keep watching.
In A New Hope, Obi-Wan makes the first blow against Vader. And in The Phantom Menace, Palpatine tells Darth Maul not to attack first. And once you know, when he encounters Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan attacks him first.
Okay, they just gave 3 examples where the Jedi attacked first. This is an extremely weak argument, but him presenting it first is an example of so-called poisoning the well. In a debate, if somebody can discredit a person before their arguments are even heard, that's an extremely powerful tactic. But yeah, okay, if the Jedi struck first, well, what are those 3 moments in comparison to the vast, decades or centuries of the war when the Empire destroyed whole planets and enslaved countless races. Oh, but no, the Jedi struck first, right? Well, yeah, sometimes in war that happens. It's a fact that's completely disconnected from the conclusion. He's saying the Jedi struck first, which is evidence the Jedi are bad. And this is a common anti-Mormon attack, the myth of infallibility, where they want you to believe that the church leaders must be infallible. So if they can bring up one little thing, or even multiple things that church leaders did, like in this case where the Jedi struck first, well then it must be all wrong, right? No faithful Latter-day Saint believes that their leaders are infallible. So don't let the opposition convince you of something in which they have no say. Anyway, I've rambled long enough. Back to the video.
But on a broader level, the Jedi initially maintained order for the sake of the Republic. But the Republic is deeply flawed.
The Republic is not what it once was.
It has no interest in the common good.
There is no interest in the common good.
And is run by bureaucrats.
The bureaucrats are in charge now.
The same Republic also sits by idly as the Trade Federation lays siege to Naboo.
A tragedy has occurred.
Which started right here with the taxation of trade routes and is now engulfed our entire planet in the oppression of the Trade Federation.
But looking at the Jedi on their own, I am at a loss for what is so righteous about them. At best, they are a part of the Republic's military. But then they are only as good as the Republic itself. At worst, they are a cult that brainwashes children at a very young age, as even Anakin Skywalker was initially too old for the Jedi.
He is to be trained then?
No. He will not be trained.
No.
He is too old.
Phew, okay, so much to discuss here. He gives us a false dichotomy where it seems like there's only two alternatives and there's no compromises and there's no other alternatives. He says that the Jedi are either just the armies, the military of the Republic, which is bad because he paints them in a bad light, or that they are a cult that brainwashes children at a very young age. Now, we both know that the Jedi are neither of those two things, nor do they sit on the spectrum between the two of those things. But he presents it as a false dichotomy. Let's continue.
I am all for people finding peace through religion, but the Jedi do play it fast and loose with their timing. Look no further than Obi-Wan taking advantage of Luke wanting to know his father.
What is it? Your father's lightsaber. This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight.
And then catapulting off the untimely death of his aunt and uncle. This is quite the predatory situation to trick somebody into a religion.
Okay, so this is just mockery and name-calling, right? To manipulate people into accepting your worldviews. It's the same when somebody says, oh, you're in a cult, or Brigham Young was a bigot, or any of a trillion other things. So back to the clip. That is not what I saw here. Even if you say it, it doesn't make it true. Obi-Wan was not manipulating Luke into joining a religion here. He was simply giving the lightsaber to Luke. But here's the thing. You and I grew up watching these movies. I remember seeing it as a kid and thinking it was like the best movie ever. And you and I know that what we're watching here is satire. So you and I are not tricked by this. But imagine, if you will, someone that has never seen these movies or even heard any of the lore behind Star Wars. Now, show them just this clip, and what are they going to come away thinking? Let's keep watching.
But it doesn't end there. Who says the Jedi are right? Pretty much only them.
For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic.
And who says the Sith and Empire are evil? Pretty much just the Jedi and rebels.
Destroy the Sith. We must.
Send me to kill the Emperor.
We are fed a narrative from only one side. Pure propaganda, to say the least.
Now, do you see how this is sowing doubt about the intentions of the Jedi? I hope you remember this video next time you hear the same thing from an atheist or anti-Mormon who says Mormons are good? Pretty much only them. They're feeding you only one side of the story. Now, there's a long argument next that Obi-Wan actually orchestrated the attack by the Sand People, and it was Obi-Wan that set fire to Luke's family home and killed his family. He argues 4 to 5 points and calls into question whether Obi-Wan was indeed the righteous, faithful Jedi that we think he is, or whether he's a murderer. Let's watch it.
When Luke and Obi-Wan come to the destroyed Sandcrawler on Tatooine, Luke makes the astute observation that it was an attack by Sand People.
It looks like the Sand People did this all right. Look, there's gaffy sticks, bantha tracks. It's just, I've never heard of them hitting anything this big before.
Obi-Wan provides a valid counter-argument. Even though in combat, formations can and do easily alter based on circumstance.
But we are meant to think they did. These tracks are side by side. Sand people always ride single file to hide their numbers.
But Obi-Wan makes a pretty baseless remark about how only stormtroopers can be so precise.
And these blast points, too accurate for sand people. Only Imperial stormtroopers are so precise.
But there are a few problems with this argument. One, stormtroopers being precise does not mean others cannot be precise. Two, he makes a blanket statement that sand people cannot shoot precisely, even though I know some pod racers that can disagree with that. And three, Obi-Wan uses a lack of evidence to further his agenda instead of relying on true evidence.
Okay, then he goes on to talk about how Obi-Wan probably actually destroyed the family home, and killed his family. So this is an example of quote mining, where somebody ignores the vast majority of right and good quotes that somebody said, like Obi-Wan in this case, and digs until they find something that sounds bad, often taking it out of context. And this just reeks of a recent trend among a very small minority of the church, who say that Joseph Smith, oh sure, he was a prophet, but then Brigham Young and others, well, they orchestrated to have Joseph Smith killed, and they often go further to say that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, and that was all Brigham Young, his invention, and most or all of the temple ordinances was Brigham Young's doing. Look, first up, that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, but for certain people, that can sound kind of exciting to hear, like, wow, they've uncovered some new information. Now, there are many problems with the argument, but the biggest one of all is that you're one step away from throwing out the entire restored gospel just because you've come up with some false narrative about how something actually played out. Let's watch to the end of this part.
But here's where things get interesting. Luke goes to see that his aunt and uncle have been killed. Burned to a crisp, by the way. Something that stormtroopers are never seen doing in any other encounters, which is odd. But even more odd, Luke returns to the sandcrawler and Obi-Wan begins the conversation, as if he already knew they were dead.
There's nothing you could have done, Luke, had you been there. You'd have been killed, too.
Pretty ironic if you ask me that the last time Obi-Wan sees Anakin, he is burning to death and literally on fire. And Anakin's brother ends up burned to nothing but his bones. And Obi-Wan seems to be in close proximity for both events.
Well, of course I know him. He's me.
I will continue this argument later on.
Okay, so he actually does not continue that argument later on, but it's a strong enough thing for him to say that to make it seem like he's got a lot more arrows in his quiver, right? But let's continue watching.
But now let's go to probably the most misconstrued aspect of the Empire, the Death Star. The Death Star in itself is emphatic proof of the Empire being moral and anti-war. This is made obvious by the fact that the Death Star was already under construction during the end of Revenge of the Sith, and not ready until the events of Rogue One. It was under construction for over 20 years. For a military with the resources of an entire galaxy at its disposal, and a military that is dealing with a well-equipped rebellion, it should have been a top construction priority, unless violence was not the main objective of the Empire.
Very interesting.
Once again, the Separatists have been engaging in a civil war against the Empire for over 2 decades.
Okay, so the point he's making is that violence was not a top objective of the Empire. And later he goes to great lengths to point out that the reason the stormtroopers miss all the time is not because they're a bad shot or because this is just a trope that has to happen in this film to keep it interesting so the good guys don't just die within 5 minutes, but because the stormtroopers were intentionally missing because they didn't want to harm anyone because they're anti-violence. Okay, well, let's keep going.
No different than how the United States dealt with the Confederate Separatists during the American Civil War. The operative word is war. Unfortunate things happen in war. During the American Civil War, the Union General William Sherman destroyed the city of Atlanta, and his troops went on a 30-mile march to the Atlantic Ocean, destroying everything in their way. So while the amount of death and destruction is incalculable, it was an event that led to a morale boost for the Union, secured Lincoln's re-election, and was a turning point in the war that almost certainly secured victory for the Union. The same can be said about the destruction of Alderaan. It was cold, callous, and reprehensible. But like all wars, it was an event that showed the galaxy that the Empire was willing to go to great lengths for reunification. I feel a quote by America's greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, further emphasizes this point. I would save the Union. I would save it in the shortest way. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be to the Union as it was. And to address the Death Star more broadly,
okay, so this is a common tactic, the appeal to authority, that something is true or false because somebody in authority said it is true or false. Now, I'm only a new channel, but I already have the inevitable comments. For example, I just got one that quoted the Smithsonian saying, there is no archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon. Now, we're naturally inclined to believe an expert, right? And we can't in any practical sense become expert archaeologists and historians and chemists and linguists and lawyers and so forth ourselves. So it's easier just to trust an expert. But here's the thing. The authority may not be as reliable as you think. The Book of Mormon has been attacked in so many ways, like anachronisms and so forth, over the years, and it turns out that one by one, all these so-called anachronisms are dropping like flies, proven true with enough time and research by experts. So no, I'm not going to trust an expert from 200 years ago. I'm not going to trust an expert from 100 years ago. They aren't as much of an expert as you might think, if you just throw a bit more time in the mix. And in the same vein, I'm not necessarily going to just trust every expert today either, without searching out other aspects of what I'm looking at. Now, of course, actual authorities, the scientists and historians you can trust, they rarely speak in black and white terms, because they've been around long enough and they are actually expert enough to know that things don't end well for you if you're 100% sure of yourself all the time. Okay, let's continue.
Tarkin made it very clear that the Death Star was to bring a swift end to the rebellion.
With a weapon that will bring a swift end to the rebellion.
A swift end to an already over 20-year war. Plus, Alderaan made the perfect target as it was both separatist and had a low population.
I have chosen to test this station's destructive power on your home planet of Alderaan.
Obi-Wan, while a clear antagonist of the Empire, was at the very least Force-sensitive. He remarked how he sensed the casualties of Alderaan as only in the millions.
As if millions of voices were suddenly silenced.
To dissect that statement even further, if there were 10 million or more people on Alderaan, then he would have said tens of millions. If there were more than 6 million people, he would have said over half a dozen million. If there were 2 million, he would have said a couple million. And if there were 3 to 5 million, he would have said a few million. Numbers don't lie. Obi-Wan clearly implies that Alderaan had less than 2 million inhabitants.
Okay, numbers don't lie. So, well, first, have you ever used the term half a dozen million? But that aside, this is an example of false premise, which is reaching a conclusion based on a premise that lacks support. This video is so sure in its conclusions that it can pinpoint the number of people on Alderaan, but I don't think Obi-Wan's word millions is solid ground to stand on in the first place. Now let's keep going.
So it makes sense. Alderaan was the best possible target to minimize civilian casualties and bring a swift end to the rebellion. It is clear that the Empire cautiously and responsibly chose a target of minimal casualties. Princess Leia, on the other hand, showed her true maniacal nature by being literally unfazed by the events. Yes, she was momentarily distraught that her planet possessions and loved ones were sacrificed in the name of peace to the Empire. No. But she never makes another mention or sign of sadness regarding the event. In fact, the only other time she brings up Alderaan is to chastise a rebel commander for showing his sympathies.
You're safe. When we heard about Alderaan, we feared the worst.
We have no time for SARS, Commander.
Okay, wow. Just wow. Going from a quote of, "We have no time for sorrows, Commander," to draw the conclusion that she has a true maniacal nature. No, she's simply a strong woman with a job to do right there in the base. So, have you ever seen anyone misconstrue quotes from modern-day prophets to try to show that the prophet is unsure or contradictory or in some ways confused or evil? I'm looking at you, Nemo the Mormon. But if you take the entirety of what those prophets and apostles say, and go to General Conference, and listen to their words, and read them again in the Ensign, and search them, and compare them with Scripture, after that, you cannot anymore support such evil and wrong misconstruals of great but imperfect men. Anyway, let's continue.
While on the topic of Leia, what type of hero is she? Not any real hero in my book.
Why are you still here?
She is a legitimate fan of incest.
Okay, this reeks against anti-Mormon arguments against polygamy. First, it's an ad hominem attack, attacking the person, Leia, instead of their arguments or instead of the premise of this video. Leia's so-called love of incest is not only probably incorrect, it's completely irrelevant to the question at hand of whether the Empire were the good guys. And this happens all the time in anti-Mormon attacks and atheist attacks against Christianity. Ad hominem doesn't lead to understanding. But if it's served fast and loose enough to you, and you think you're getting all these puzzle pieces and understanding something new, but it's unrelated to what you're trying to understand, all it does is turn the listener's heart cold towards the subject of the attack, in this case, Leia. Let's keep watching.
Now to shift gears a bit. As things go regarding the Empire, all logical evidence points to a loving and merciful government.
Be a part of something. Join the Empire. Explore new worlds. Learn valuable skills. Bring order and unity to the galaxy.
For starters, look at how Vader dealt with Leia and the stolen Death Star plans. He commandeered the ship when destroying it would have been easier and still kept the plans away from the rebels. During the same encounter, at best, the stormtroopers provide suppressive fire, and things do not escalate until the bloodthirsty rebels make the first fatal shot.
Okay, the bloodthirsty rebels make the first fatal shot. Okay, there's a double standard here, right? He starts out by saying that all evidence points to a loving and merciful government of the Galactic Empire. But he's only considering evidence X, Y, Z, and he's not considering evidence A, B, C, which you and I both know that 99% of the video is evidence that the Jedi are good and on the right side, and maybe 1% of the film could be snipped here and misconstrued. So this idea of the double standard of treating two or more people or issues differently, even though they should be treated the same, and also exactly what should be considered as evidence, it's no clearer than in the example of like witnesses, right? Witnesses of the Book of Mormon, witnesses of Christ's resurrection, I mean. So critics of the Book of Mormon claim that the witnesses to the gold plates were unreliable, that they were just family, so they're part of the secret club. They're not even witnesses, and they were just names that Oliver Cowdery wrote down, and so forth. They come up with, a list of reasons why they are not good witnesses. But those same Christians who might make this argument against the Book of Mormon forget that in this case, our 19 strong witnesses to the Book of Mormon, 11 in the intro to the Book of Mormon and several others that gave statements separately, none of them ever recanted to their deathbeds. And our 19 strong witnesses beats out the maybe 3 first-hand witnesses of the resurrected Jesus. So you can't accept the 3 witnesses of the resurrection and not accept the 19 stronger and larger in number witnesses of the Book of Mormon without creating a double standard. So another example is the case of horses. Horses, they say, there were no horses in the New World, anachronism. But they forget that the Bible talks about lions running around native in Israel. And we only recently discovered lion bones in recent decades in the area. Or a Christian may say, well, there's no evidence for the Book of Mormon. To which I say, there is a lot of evidence if you take the time to dig in. And yet, the Bible talks about Moses' exodus from Egypt, but we have almost not a shred of evidence for that. My point is, there should not be a double standard, but often there is. Let's keep going.
And let's keep in mind, the rebels stole the plans to the Death Star, a legitimate weapon of mass destruction. And much like how the real world wants to keep weapons of mass destruction out of the maniacal hands of North Korea, Iran, and Iraq under Saddam Hussein, the Galactic Empire wanted to keep that technology away from the warmongering rebels. But back to the peace and love of the Empire. They are job creators. These massive ships and space stations are not being built for free. As well as, let's be honest, there isn't much indication that life under the Empire is that bad after all. When I see the Empire, I see an Imperial shuttle parking a polite distance from Galen Erso's house. I see a gracious host standing to greet his guests.
We would be honored if you would join us.
I see the government outsourcing work to private citizens.
There will be a substantial reward for the one who finds the Millennium Falcon.
I see the government helping a youth get a job and an identity.
What's your name, son?
Hunt.
What? Who are your people?
I don't have people. I'm alone.
Solo.
I see secular government crushing religious fanaticism.
The holy city will be enough for today.
Target Jeddah City. Prepare single reactor ignition.
I see a stormtrooper guiding traffic. I see a garbage compactor not being used so a creature can live in it. I see a government that believes in smaller government.
The rebellion will continue to gain a support in the Imperial Senate.
The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us. I have just received word that the Emperor has dissolved the Council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away.
That's impossible. How will the Emperor maintain control without the bureaucracy?
The regional governors now have direct control over their territories.
I see the will of the people come to fruition, as the Empire is created by the democratically elected Senate, and by definition, is the will of the people.
The Republic will be reorganized into the first Galactic Empire for a safe and secure society.
So I recently made a video saying how much Alyssa Grenfell, who's a prominent anti-Mormon YouTuber, was making off of YouTube ads. And most of the comments were actually defending Alyssa, and it sounded a lot like, and I'm paraphrasing, well, when I see Alyssa, I see a person who is bringing great truth and light and so forth. And someone even said something like, okay, so imagine Alyssa was on drugs and then she broke the habit. So now she's off drugs, but all she's doing is warning people against doing drugs, right? But no, the church is not drugs. Drugs is the path to a lot of bad things. The church is your path to eternal increase. And I'm sorry you had a bad experience. It happens. This is a crazy, messy life, and some people will bump around and have a bad experience. But look, back to the video. This comment is as much of a misconstrual about this whole Galactic Empire garbage as that.
Now, I do have to concede slightly to the rebels. They have medical frigates to take care of the wounded, and the Empire does not. However, the peace-loving Empire doesn't need such ships since they do not rely on violence to get their way.
Okay, so here's another example of a fallacy or an argument or a tactic that's being used. The straw man. It's where you set up the opponent's argument to be weaker than it is and then demolish it and claim victory. So the fact that the rebels have medical frigates is not the strongest argument for the rebels being either good or evil, right? It's almost irrelevant. But if you can set that argument up and then demolish it one by one at a time, you can set up all these weak arguments and demolish them, then you might get somewhere with your target. So making straw man arguments is dishonest because it doesn't represent the true strength of the other side. Now, this next bit is actually my favorite, so let's watch this.
But on a broader level, we can see how the filmmakers subtly told us who was good and evil. The Empire shoots green lasers, which mean go in peace.
Prepare for jump to hyperspace.
While the rebels shoot red lasers, which means stop and die.
Oh, that is funny. But it gets better. It gets better. Just watch.
Even looking at the lightsabers is further proof of this. In The Phantom Menace between Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan, and Darth Maul, the lightsabers provide the same subtle meaning, with Maul's saber coloring implying stop, stop, I do not want to hurt you, with the Jedi lightsaber subtly saying, I will fight you so hard that you will feel blue, and go and die.
Okay, so this is buried way deep in the video. At this point, not everyone's paying full attention. But note that he uses one argument for red and green, and then uses the exact opposite for the lightsabers. If you weren't paying full attention, you wouldn't catch it. So for the ships, the Empire uses green lasers, which means go in peace, right? And the rebels use red, which means stop and die. But then for the lightsabers, he says Darth Maul uses red, which means stop, stop, I do not want to hurt you. And the Jedi green lightsaber means go and die. But look, here's the thing. This whole video is an example of Gish gallop, which is an illusion of proof by sheer mass of material, where you just kind of get lost in the rapid-fire set of details. And there's no way that anyone can check every detail. Much like the so-called CES letter, which is an anti-Mormon open letter from a few years ago, it tries to put together hundreds of critiques of the claims of the church, and the reader reading it for the first time, well, they may be overwhelmed and think, well, there's no way that there can be any room remaining for the church to be true. But if that same reader actually examines the claims of the CES letter carefully, which takes a long time because it's huge, right? But, well, the whole thing falls apart. And many people have done debunking after debunking, point by point of the CES letter. So you can go watch those if you like. My point is, this is a common tactic. And the antidote is faith, is waiting, is being able to tolerate ambiguity in your mind for a while, is doubting your doubts first, rather than doubting your faith. The antidote is realizing what tactics these people are using, which is really the point of this video. Okay, look, I think we're done here. I haven't even shown half of this video. I've skipped a bunch of it, and I haven't even talked about half of the logical fallacies and tactics that Austin Fife talks about in the Light and Truth letter. But you can go check those out. The Kindle book is just like $2 right now, or you can get the PDF for free from lightandtruthletter.com. But just know that these people who so freely attack, they do not care about you. They do not have your best interests in mind. They are not your friends. They can easily spin a narrative and twist things, as Isaiah says, "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." They can take things sweet and good, like family relationships, and make it seem bad and oppressive. They can take things right and true, like God's ability and desire to speak to man even today through prophets, and can make it seem somehow either of the devil or delusional. They can take things as obvious as the divine identity of men and women, and they can just mix it all up. They can make these false compromises to say, okay, well, you're on this end of the scale, and the reality is this end of the scale, but they don't have to convince you enough to pull you all the way to the other end of the scale. They just have to pull you partway along the scale, because they know that the middle ground between truth and lies is not where the truth is. So yeah, they can make these outrageous claims, and they've won, even if they can just get you to budge a little bit. So stay strong. The Galactic Empire was not right. They always were and always will be the bad guys. The Jedi are the heroes. This is Sort of Laban, out.